Welcome back to this episode of Theologically Driven. I'm your host, Phil Cecil, and today we have a special guest in the studio, Brandon Crawford. Brandon, you're a grad of DBTS and the senior pastor of Grace Baptist Church in Marshall, Michigan.
That's correct. Graduate of DBTS in 2010, received my MDiv, and immediately afterwards headed to Marshall, which is about 90 miles west of here, to become the pastor of Grace. Been there ever since.
Good. And we're also joined by Dr. Ryan Meyer. Did you guys overlap in school, or was Brandon?
We didn't. I came a little bit afterwards.
A little bit after. Yeah. Okay. So Dr. Meyer teaches New Testament at DBTS, so thank you both for coming on. We want to think today a little bit about church and politics, political issues, that type of thing. Brandon has written a book called Let Men Be Free. It's a Christian vision for ordered liberty, and this is out recently with G3 Press. So thankful, Brandon, for your work here to serve the church and help the church. It seems obvious, as we would say, like regular Americans, as we look out our window and we might wonder, what in the world happened? So it just seems, even just recent political chaos, and thankfully the campaigns are over, so all the political ads can stop now. But it can be easy to think, like, where did our country go? So if you could maybe briefly walk us through kind of, where we are now, where things stand, and maybe how we got to this point.
Sure. And I have gotten that question regularly over the last few years, particularly during the COVID pandemic. A lot of people were very confused inside and outside of my local church. I was fielding questions from people in our community through email and Facebook, just trying to make sense of how we arrived at this place in our nation's history, and with such an overbearing federal government and state governments too. To understand the cultural moment, I couldn't recommend a better resource than Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. That does a fantastic job of helping us understand this present context. But if you want to understand what has happened in politics, I think we need to go back to the early 20th century and to the rise of the progressive movement in politics. And really the first national champion of this was Woodrow Wilson. In the early 1900s, he campaigned for what he called a new freedom in America. He was very optimistic about human nature, believed in the innate goodness of man, believed that our society was perfectible if only the systems could be tweaked in such a way that would allow for human flourishing. And so what he envisioned was an imperial president who was essentially rubber-stamped by Congress, funded by a progressive income tax, and whose policies were implemented through a bureaucratic apparatus, and that through the policies of the bureaucracy, he could create the environment necessary to allow for a utopian society. Okay? He had a very negative view of the U.S. Constitution with its convictions about the fallibility of man, the fallenness of human nature, and its systems of checks and balances. He believed that this document was wholly inadequate for meeting the needs of modern man. And so the bureaucratic state was the brainchild of the early progressives. And really from that time until the present time, the story of American politics has been a story of that bureaucratic state growing larger and larger, to the point where now the federal government is in virtually every aspect of American life. And this is not only against constitutional order, but it's also dangerous now, because the prevailing worldview of our governing authorities is not biblical. Okay, there is an unchristian, sometimes even an anti-Christian worldview governing their decision-making. And so when you have this vast bureaucratic apparatus that is in every part of life, and the decisions that are being made, the policies implemented through that apparatus, are contrary to Christian conviction, you end up in the situation that we are in right now.
Yeah, so the government, or maybe the public square, for lack of a better term, begins to secularize, and this is kind of the rise of, the government is your provider, right? The government can be, your parents. It can provide things for you. Maybe it would be a good thing to think a little bit about what would be the role of government. So as we see it, obviously we disagree with the current way things are moving. In your mind and in your book, what do you lay out as kind of the mandate for the state?
Yeah. Your earlier comment reminds me of a statement made by Barney Frank a number of years ago, where he said, government is just the word we use to describe everything that we do together in our society. Now, that's an extremely expansive view of government, right? That everything that involves collective action in society is a proper area for government to be involved. Okay, I think that goes far beyond the biblical limitations of government. So from a biblical perspective, I guess I would define government this way. It's a God-ordained institution established to ensure a peaceable coexistence between members of different households. Okay? And the way the government does that is by securing the fundamental rights of each of its citizens. Okay? That is the beginning and the end of the government's responsibility from a biblical standpoint.
So do you see, how would one in this system determine which households are involved in the government? So there's lots of debate about what is a nation, what constitutes a nation. How does the government determine its jurisdiction?
Yeah. Well, a nation is a geographically bounded body of persons who generally share a same history, a language. There will be a national culture that is shared, and there will be a government, ideally chosen by that citizenry to secure their rights for them. And so the relationship is bounded geographically and by the consent of the governed.
Yeah. Do you think that our constitutional republic is the best form of government in this age? So
yes, in my view, what we have historically had here in the United States is the best available system for ensuring that tyranny is kept in check, that the government is responsive to its citizens, that the fundamental rights of every citizen is being protected. I can't envision a system that would be better than this one in a fallen world.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I thought the way you set up the book, talking about the rise of the progressive movement, was really helpful. I can't remember if it was that portion of the book or later in the book, you made a statement that caught my attention where you said that the secular worldview that we see today, in a sense, is an apostate Christianity. So would it be fair to say that we actually have two competing views of what it means to be a Christian? And is that a fair way to put it? And does that impact what's happening? The reason I ask is because I think a lot of progressives, they're well-intentioned. They actually care about the poor, they care about the immigrant, they care about climate, and they think they're helping these people. And so it could be that they then view us as being unchristian because we don't care. I don't know if that is exactly what you were saying in the book when you talked about an apostate Christianity or an alternate form of Christianity, but I don't know if that would maybe address some of the issues that Phil's referring to.
Yeah. So the idea of the modern progressive or secularist movement being apostate Christianity was introduced to me by Kevin Swanson, who wrote a book entitled Apostate, and he walks through some of the early evolutionary thinkers, early philosophers that really moved the West in a new direction. And he demonstrated quite convincingly to me that these were all individuals who had come from an Orthodox Christian background, but who had abandoned that in favor of this new way of thinking. And particularly here in America, on the political scene, many of the people arguing for militant secularism self-identify as Christians. And they claim that what they're doing is the Christian approach to governance. But if you were to dig into their theological convictions, you would find that they are often the precise opposite of biblical Christianity. Christianity affirms the fallenness of human nature, whereas modern secularists would affirm the innate goodness, even perfectibility of human nature. Okay, so just one example among many that causes me to say that the modern progressive or secularist movement is a departure from biblical Christianity. Many within the movement might identify as Christian, but their convictions are at odds. And their convictions about even the nature and the role of government in human societies is vastly different from what we find in the Scriptures. Scriptures present us with a very limited scope for a government activity, not a vast scope.
Is there any connection to American liberalism from the 20s, like a direct line that can be drawn to what would now be a militant secularist?
Yeah. Well, I think politics runs downstream of culture.
Okay.
So it starts often in the academy, in the world of ideas, and it filters its way through society. So yes, it starts as a philosophical conviction, and then it moves its way into the various aspects of society, into entertainment, into education, and by the early 20th century, it had worked its way into politics.
Yeah, and it creates a circular kind of spiral, too. As more culture changes, it begets more changing culture in a wrong direction, right? Yeah, so thinking about how government should be set up, you put out the constitutional republic idea. I could see someone, especially someone in our stream of things, and this might tip my hand as to where I want to go with the conversation, but they might be thinking, well, one day when Jesus comes back, he will actually set up a monarchy. So shouldn't we in some ways try to model what Israel had in the Old Testament and what Jesus will one day again have? Why the shift? So
okay. The answer to both of those questions is no.
Yeah, right.
We should not try to replicate Old Testament Israel, and we should not try to establish a theocratic system now or some kind of a Christian monarchy now. Regarding Old Testament Israel, that nation was unique in all of world history. That this is the only nation in the history of the world that was established directly by divine covenant. And it also had a very unique purpose in the world, the chief purpose being to serve as the vehicle through which the Messiah would enter the world. And so this required Israel to be a consecrated nation. Okay? This explains the uniqueness of Israel as a nation. Okay? And so we don't want to try to replicate that. We could not replicate that now. And as far as the idea of a Christian monarchy is concerned, or what Stephen Wolfe calls, I think, theocratic Caesarism, or something along those lines, the trouble with that is that Jesus is all-powerful and all-good, and we are neither. And so to give even the best among us absolute authority, as a monarch today, when he has a sinful nature, and he is not all wise, and he is not all powerful in all of that, when he is just a fallen man like all of us, this is setting us up for disaster. And even if the first one that we select manages to do a pretty good job, what about his successor? Okay, this is a system doomed to descend into tyranny of the worst sort. Okay, we don't want to try to establish a theocratic kingdom in America or anywhere on the earth when the perfect king is absent. Okay. He will establish a perfect kingdom. Okay, that's his will for this earth, a perfect kingdom of righteousness. But he's going to do it himself when he comes back. We should not be trying to bring it to pass now on our own, apart from his physical presence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Israel should be the ultimate example of that, right? I mean, they have this theocracy, they have God as their king, they have a perfect constitution, but since they're not regenerate, they actually do fall into corruption and tyranny. You know, I keep going back to the progressives. I think the progressives are often correct about the symptoms in our society, but since they reject the idea that the underlying disease is sin, then they also reject that the cure is regeneration. But I think you could say the same thing about Israel. You know,
Yeah.
Israel starts out with a good king, but it quickly corrupts itself.
It quickly descends.
Yes.
There's an important passage in the Old Testament. It's found in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And the Lord is warning Israel of some of the negative consequences that will come if they insist on having a king. And one of the things that he says is that this king will be so cruel that he will take a tenth of your wealth, for himself. Now, think of that, a monarch so corrupt, a government so corrupt that they would dare to take 10%
We'd be happy with that.
of your wealth. Yes, but look where we are. Look where we are
Exactly.
today.
Yeah.
So corruption is inevitable when you give plenary powers to a fallen man.
So it'd be fair to say we need two things. We need a good king, and we also need to be made new. We also need to be born again if we're actually going to have a
Precisely.
perfect society. Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah. This, I think, would be a good point to say. So we talked a little bit about militant secularism, and it seems fair to say, kind of the first question I asked, like, what in the world happened? It seems like that experiment has failed completely. Like the evidence, people have pronouns in their email bios. Like people have gone off the rails on that.
Doug Wilson has put this in a way that only he could. That modern secularism has taken itself behind the barn and shot itself.
Yeah, it does.
It's done.
Yeah,
as a
it
system.
does seem like he's right about that. But that also then presents an opportunity that I think a lot of people are trying to jump on today of what's next. What do we do next? And a big buzzword that people will hear is called Christian nationalism. It's almost impossible to define, but I wonder if you interact with Wilson and Stephen Wolfe quite a bit. So maybe could you give us a definition? What is Christian nationalism as you see it?
Well, you're right to note that Christian nationalism has 1,000 definitions. Maybe you're familiar with that reporter from Politico who recently defined a Christian nationalist as a person who believes our rights come from God instead of government. Okay?
Right.
Well, by that definition, we're all Christian nationalists.
Most American
And in
history.
fact, the founding fathers were Christian nationalists.
right.
Thomas Jefferson is a Christian nationalist by that definition. So I think we recognize that's an absurd definition. So for the purposes of my book, I relied on Stephen Wolfe's definition. And what Stephen Wolfe is really arguing for in his runaway bestseller, The Case for Christian Nationalism, is essentially a return to medieval Europe, or perhaps early modern Europe with its Protestant establishments. He wants to see a reunion of church and state, such that every citizen of the nation is being baptized at birth, and the civil authorities are using their power to enforce church attendance, to ban false religions, to punish heresies, and even, for Stephen Wolfe, even to arrange the church furniture. He believes that the Christian prince has the right to say, for example, that the pulpit should be elevated above the communion table in the church auditorium. Now, Christian nationalists of that variety believe that this is the only solution. Okay? They've seen that the modern secularist state is an abject failure, and they say the only way to restore order and liberty again is through this system, this kind of return to a wedding of church and state, and using the civil power to ensure that sound doctrine is maintained and sound Christian morality is maintained in the land. But what I argue for in the book is that this actually sets us up for a new kind of tyranny. When you give a civil power the right to decide what is true doctrine and what is false, when you give him the power to coerce the human conscience, to cause them to worship in a way that they are convinced is wrong, when you give the civil power the authority to tell the local church how to arrange its furniture, it's only a matter of time before this power is abused, and that the true Church of Christ is actually finding itself a persecuted minority in the society, right, instead of a protected majority, which is what their goal is. And I refer to this as the Christian nationalist paradox, that in their desire to preserve church and state, they would actually create a system that undermines both.
Right. And I think you use Western Europe as a good example of that, right, in the book. That we can actually
I do.
Yeah.
And I say to Wilson and to Wolfe and to others who find this vision compelling, look at Western Europe today. Look at New England here in the States today. The places where this was attempted are the very places now that are most hostile to biblical Christianity. There was a built-up resentment to this way of governing that now has made it very difficult to penetrate these places with the true gospel of Christ.
Yeah.
I thought that was a good point.
Yeah. So, too, since I brought up the Christian nationalist thing, a couple of points on them. And as much as I understand it, they would be arguing for a non-establishmentarian state, right? So there wouldn't be one church set up. But it seems to me that if the civil government is going to be handing down mandates to the church, you would almost have to have, maybe you don't call it a state church, but there has to be some theological convictions to come down on. I mean, that seemed like a fair critique of
right.
that.
There are differences between the various self-identifying Christian nationalists. There are even differences between Wilson and Wolfe on this. Wolfe, I think, is much more willing to enforce a robust, say, post-Reformation confession of faith upon the society. He is very comfortable positioning the church almost as a department of the state. Okay. Whereas Wolfe is a little bit more relaxed on this. He would like to see the Apostles' Creed enshrined in the U.S. Constitution.
You mean Wilson?
Yes, did I say Wolfe?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Just
yeah,
so we're clear.
Wilson would like to see the Apostles' Creed enforced in the land. He would allow for churches that do not accept the Apostles' Creed. He would accept false religions in the land. They just wouldn't be able to hold political office and things like this. Okay. But in terms of the governing authorities, they would need to affirm the absolute bare minimum of Christian orthodoxy.
And I think another point of tension I understand with these systems is everything I've read from Christian nationalist guys would say we cannot coerce belief. We cannot coerce the conscience. So this is like Calvin's inward-outward man, the inward man governed directly by God. They would say we cannot force people, individuals, to make a profession of faith. But by then stamping down on religious liberty and enshrining things like the Apostles' Creed and the Constitution, if you make, blasphemy laws or things like that, it seems like you are in some ways coercing behavior that would not line up with the conscience. So you use the expression, if I'm remembering correctly from your book, people could have belief, but then they don't have the avenue to express belief. And that in some ways is a contradiction. Could you say a little bit to that?
Yeah, I'll speak specifically to Stephen Wolfe's position on this. He agrees that the conscience answers to God and that nobody can be compelled to believe something they don't believe. But he has no problem with governing a person's speech, their associations, their options for worship, and things along these lines. And the reason is because he says anything that does or at least has the potential to cause harm to society, that this is an area in which government can rightfully be involved. Mm-hmm. And I argue strongly against that in the book, that the government is not responsible for putting a stop to or punishing anything that could really or even potentially be a harm to society. No, government has a very limited mandate, right? Simply to secure our basic rights. And that includes the right of conscience, okay, to believe what we are personally convinced of. But then directly connected to that is the ability to express those beliefs. Okay? God created us as social beings. And the idea that it's okay for government to leave the conscience alone, but it can require us to assent to a doctrine that we don't hold, well, that's a violation of conscience as well. Okay? To be a social being and to have true freedom of conscience means that you have the freedom to believe and then to express that belief and to associate with people of like mind.
Mm-hmm. Now, certainly that there would have to be limitations on that. So where do you see the line? So I believe God wants me to do some terrible thing that would seriously harm or hurt. Obviously, I cannot express that to the fullest. So how do you draw the line there?
Well, I would say that you have the right to express your opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Any opinion, really, that is in line with your true belief. What you do not have the right to do is to cause real, tangible, or bodily harm to another person.
Okay.
I think
the difference there would be not emotional harm, right? That's
right.
What, I say something mean to you, and now you feel sad, right?
Yeah.
Right, and I'm taking this from Genesis chapter 9, where God gives to the government the power of the sword. And the example used there is with murder, right? If you commit murder, then the government has the authority to use the sword against you. Well, murder is causing real, tangible, or bodily harm to another human being, okay? Government is not empowered to coerce your conscience. It's not empowered to make you affirm a doctrine that you do not believe, but it does have the power to coerce behaviors that could cause real harm. And I would include within that slander, lies that have the effect of destroying a person, okay? Because that has caused real, tangible, or bodily harm to a person, okay? If I tell a lie about you, knowingly a lie about you that costs you your livelihood, you're fired from your job, okay? That's not okay either, okay? Right. The principles of Scripture would allow the government to come after a person who has done that.
Yeah, that's good. I wonder, so in political thought, oftentimes, especially religious political thought, Baptists are kind of left out in the cold. So we haven't had a great track record of having major figureheads. So when I think of political thought, like I'm thinking of like John Calvin and Luther and how their different versions of this played out. I wonder where you see yourself in the stream of political thought today. Some terms will get thrown out that I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with. So things like Kuyperianism or a two kingdoms model. Would you see yourself borrowing from any of those or not at all? Where would you position yourself at?
Well, some of my ideas have certainly been borrowed from the Protestant reformers, particularly Calvin, Luther. The doctrine of interposition is a very important principle in the relation between church and state and individuals and the state. Okay, that comes from the Protestant reformers. But for much of my understanding of the biblical relationship between the individual and the state, the church and the state, this comes from my Baptist forebears. Okay, we do have some very astute political thinkers in the Baptist tradition. Okay, John Leland is one clear example who argued forcefully for religious liberty in colonial America and then in the early days of the United States. And so I look to them as well.
Yeah. So since we've talked about religious liberty multiple times, it can seem like religious liberty is what got us into this mess. right? Because if you let everyone express their opinions, then eventually people start believing wacky things. Is it possible to maintain religious liberty for however long we have to be here?
Yeah, you're very insightful to notice this potential issue. And Kevin Bowder actually calls it the Baptist paradox.
Okay.
And what he means is that the concept of religious liberty arose within a society that was dominated by evangelical Protestant thought. And he also notes that it can only be sustained within a society dominated by evangelical Protestant thought. But the minute you move away from that worldview to another, you start to redefine your terms, you start to change your convictions, and suddenly religious liberty itself becomes threatened. So the question is, how then do you maintain religious liberty? Well, the first thing that I would note there is that the alternatives have not been particularly good at preserving religious liberty either. Okay, look at the church-state establishments from Northern Europe, Western Europe, the New England colonies, and then the New England states. They were not able to preserve Christian categories particularly well over the long term either. Okay, so it's not a problem unique to Baptists and their convictions about religious liberty for all. But how does it get preserved then? Well, we have to do our best to make as persuasive case as possible for a Christian understanding of things. Okay? We have to argue persuasively for our definitions of the terms, liberty, justice, equality, and the like. We need to argue persuasively for the value of having a free church in a free state. We need to argue as persuasively as we can for the biblical limitations that are placed upon civil government. And all we can do as individuals is enter the marketplace of ideas and argue our position the very best that we can. And by the way, the Church of Christ could do a great service to the country simply by being the church, not getting distracted, not getting pulled into politics or culture war issues, but to focus on its mission of preaching the gospel, baptizing converts, and then discipling those converts into full Christian maturity. Okay? If the church will simply be the church, and if we as Christian citizens individually will do our part to make the case for a state that is ordered by biblical principles, okay, this is the best hope that we have for maintaining it long term.
Yeah, that's good. I'm curious in discussions, sometimes the idea of how Christian do we make the laws comes up, right? So where do we draw the line on certain laws, and then how do we have principles? I couldn't find it in the book, but I'm wondering if you've interacted much with natural law, and do you see that as kind of a legitimate understanding of how we would come up with more Christian laws?
Okay. So first I would want to understand what you mean by Christian laws, or how Christian can we make the law? I mean, are you talking about laws against murder and theft?
Nope.
Are you talking about laws about doctrine and church attendance and things like that?
Right.
Or maybe this might help, like you talked in the book about compulsory education. Yep. So in my understanding, it's the Puritans that first brought that to the U.S. and Massachusetts, correct? I might be wrong about that. But so basically they thought in a well-ordered society, you should have well-trained children who can read the scriptures. Well, then, would we promote a law that says all children should go to school so that they would be well-functioning citizens who can read the scriptures and think clearly for themselves? Okay. Or would that be interfering in a sphere that's not our own?
Right. So, again, I think that the scriptures give the civil authorities a very narrow mandate, right? The beginning and end of their job is to secure the fundamental rights of their citizenry. That includes the right to live, the right to a clear conscience, the right to a free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the freedom to pursue marriage and family life, the freedom to pursue an honorable vocation, the freedom to keep the fruits of their hard labors. Okay. The government's job begins and ends with securing those rights. Right? Rights are just immutable freedoms that we have, which are grounded in our identity as image bearers of God and in the calling that God has placed upon us to form families, to do work. Okay. So the government has no legitimate authority over the educational choices that parents want to make for their children. Okay. I don't think the government has any rightful place to say all children in this nation must be educated in this way. That is for parents to decide.
I don't know if that was a good example of what you were thinking of, or maybe, I took us off track.
No, I thought that's in line. I can throw out another example. So gay marriage is currently legal, technically. In your understanding, should that be legal or not? And if so, why?
No, it should not be legal.
Okay.
Because the government has the responsibility to honor the other institutions that God has ordained. Family is also a God-ordained institution. And in the scriptures, God defines the family as, well, let me start with marriage, right, which is the beginnings of family life. Through the scriptures, God defines marriage as the covenantal union of one man and one woman. Right? So the civil government has the responsibility to honor that divine institution, to protect it, to preserve it, not to change the definition, not to do anything to undermine marriage as it was ordained. And so the government ought not to have codified so-called gay marriage as a constitutional right.
Yeah. So just pushing back and asking questions here.
Yes.
So then would that be taking the Bible and forcing it down on as because we're not theonomists, so we don't want to see the Bible as the law of God as the law of the land in that sense. But aren't we then taking something that's in the Bible and forcing it down on people using the Bible to make laws? Or what I've seen some people try to do is with the natural law argument is there's the Bible would rule over the church, but we could still make a case from natural law that things like gay marriage, for example, should be outlawed. Do you see what
I see what you mean. And
Okay.
I think natural law arguments are wholly inadequate.
Okay.
I think they're wholly inadequate. And so any argument that I would bring into the public square would be biblically rooted, okay? And I would want to make the case just as forcefully as I can for biblical truth. And when it comes to the institution of marriage, this is not a Christian institution. This is an institution ordained of God for all humanity. And human flourishing is not possible if we undermine or in any way change the definition of marriage as God ordained it. So because it was ordained of God for all people, not just Christians, and because civil government has the responsibility to honor the other institutions of God, then government has a right and a responsibility to protect marriage as biblically defined. Okay, that's my position.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good.
But, we live in a world, obviously, where our position, our biblical worldview is steadily becoming the minority position. I think that'd be fair to say. So we do live in a world where the government says your children should be taught a certain way and that marriage can be between two men or two women. So if I'm hearing you correctly, we don't have a responsibility to change that by force, but we have a responsibility to model a biblical worldview in our own families and churches and to proclaim that worldview to those who disagree. Would that be your position in a nutshell? Yeah.
Exactly. So I have the responsibility to order my life biblically in all areas, right? My family life, my church life, my civic life, my vocational life, all of it has to be ordered biblically. And I need to submit myself to Scripture. I need to model a biblical life to the society around me. And when it comes to these matters of the law, okay, in this case, the law of the land is not forcing me to enter into a homosexual union. And so this is not an opportunity for me to engage in civil disobedience or something like that, right? But because this is harmful to society as a whole, because it is against an institution of God, and there's no way that my society can flourish so long as God's institutions are being flaunted. Okay? In the public square, it's my responsibility now to make the best case that I can for the biblical concept of marriage, in the hopes that we can turn the tide and I can win enough hearts and minds over that the law will be changed to reflect biblical truth once again.
So religious liberty then, in that sense, is not equal to a neutral, what I've heard some people call a neutral public square. You actually are arguing for some type of Christian influenced society.
Yes, I actually agree with the Christian nationalists on this point,
Okay,
that there is no such thing as a neutral public square. And there's no way that we could create one either, because there's no such thing as a neutral human being. We all enter the public square with intellectual, moral, spiritual convictions. And so our job is to enter the public square with the convictions we have, and as persuasively as possible to make the case that our position is the correct one, and hope that we can win enough people over to our side. And I invite the others in the square to do the same thing.
But in a way that doesn't hurt other people, so not blocking our borders with your trucks or doing things that would hurt other people's livelihood or their property.
Right.
Yeah.
This came into the chapter on civil disobedience,
Yeah.
that when it comes to disobeying an unlawful order, you can never break a just law in order to protest an unjust law. Right? And that's what happened in the example that you're mentioning. Thousands of truck drivers blocking highways and bridges
Right.
in order to try to coerce the government to adopt a new policy. You cannot sin against your government in your attempt to promote righteousness in the government.
Do you think it's possible, given the current state of affairs, to get back to a more Christianized religious liberty that we might kind of remember from distant past?
Well, I leave that matter to God. God has done amazing things in the past. I think of the First Great Awakening, when upwards of 25% of all of the colonists converted to the Christian faith and joined churches, and that changed the whole trajectory of North America. Okay? God could do that again if he wanted to. He could soften the hearts of the people that we're speaking to so that our words are persuasive. He could give our local churches tremendous gospel success. He could allow us to disciple a great host of new Americans, and maybe the rising generation of citizens will turn back to the very best of former times. There never was a golden age in America. Okay, our whole history includes some just grievous societal sins. So I don't want to suggest that there was some golden age of the past,
Right.
and to express some desire to go back. Just if we could only go back 100 years, life would be so great. No. There are things that I don't want to bring back from the past. But if God should be pleased to open hearts, to use our churches to convert many, then absolutely there is hope for a very bright future.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to end it. So thank you, Brandon, so much. May God be so pleased to use us in His work and to do that. Thank you for writing this book. So this is Let Men Be Free. I assume it's available now on Amazon.
It is. You
wherever.
can find it on the G3 Ministries website as well as Amazon.
Okay, great. So hope that will be a resource to you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Theologically Driven. If you'd like to learn more about Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary, you can do that at dbts.edu.